14-year-old Fleetwood Lindley pedaled his bicycle from Springfield High School to Oak Ridge Cemetery as fast as he could. His father had phoned the school asking that he come to the Lincoln tomb at once so that he could witness something he would never forget. Joseph Lindley was a member of the Lincoln Guard of Honor, and he had recently overseen the placement of the remains of the martyred president and his family into the newly refurbished tomb. Fleetwood had no idea what he was about to see when he wheeled his bicycle up to the memorial. He entered the crypt where his father and over 20 dignitaries were standing around the coffin of the nation's 16th president. The air was thick and hot in the cramped chamber, and everyone stepped aside to clear a path for two workmen carrying tools and a blowtorch. With a nod from the lead official, they went to work with hammers and chisels on the lead-lined coffin lid. Finally, they lifted off a section of the coffin, and everyone in the room stepped forward to look. The choking odor of decay filled the room. Fleetwood's father put an arm around his son's shoulder, encouraging him to move closer. Leaning forward, he was suddenly looking upon a face that was as familiar to him as his own. He said that the president's features were covered in a thin, chalky white mold that looked like a layer of frost. But the prominent forehead and nose, chin whiskers and cheek mole were all still there and unmistakable. After a few breathless moments, someone in the room said in a hushed voice, "It's him." Then everyone stepped back as the workmen replaced the section of coffin lid. Fleetwood watched as the mortal remains of Abraham Lincoln were forever cut off from the light. Later, he would hold one of the leather straps that lowered the coffin into a steel cage 10 feet below the floor of the crypt. Once in place, it was covered in cement. Just as Fleetwood's father had promised, he would never forget the events of that day. And over 60 years later, when he was the last living person who could say they looked upon the face of Lincoln, he told his tale to Life magazine. He said the coffin was open so that there would be no doubt that it was truly the body of the president encased in all that cement. But he added that curiosity probably played a part in it too. He said that he wasn't scared at the time, but admitted that he went to bed with Lincoln for the next 6 months. The event that Fleetwood Lindley witnessed on that autumn afternoon so long ago was the last chapter in the strange 36-year journey of Abraham Lincoln's body. Come walk with me and explore the secrets of Lincoln's tomb. In May 1860, Abraham and Mary Lincoln attended the dedication ceremony for Oak Ridge Cemetery. It was a perfect spring day, and the clean rural setting made the world seem new. The candidate and his wife strolled the grounds together. Lincoln was so taken in by the rustic beauty that he told his wife he hoped to be buried in a quiet place like this someday. 5 years later, the memory of that day in Oak Ridge seemed distant, but it was very much on her mind. Death and burial were not things that Mary liked to contemplate even on her best days. And since her husband's death, she had been too distraught to leave her room in the White House, let alone plan a funeral. The selection of Oak Ridge Cemetery as Abraham Lincoln's final resting place now seems like it was a foregone conclusion, but in fact the decision wasn't made until the last minute, and even then it wasn't without controversy. As Springfield was Lincoln's home, the state of Illinois requested that he be buried there, but Mary was hesitant. It was only after being persuaded by her son Robert that she gave her consent. Within days, a memorial committee was formed to oversee the burial arrangements. However, Mary and the committee had different ideas on where the grave should be located. Initially, Oak Ridge Cemetery was ruled out because it was in the country, and the committee feared it would take the focus away from the downtown area. The city had already purchased acreage in the middle of town, and they felt that having Abraham Lincoln's grave there would be more convenient for tourists, but more importantly, it would stimulate business. They were so sure of themselves that they began construction on the president's tomb without notifying his widow. When word reached Mary, she was incensed. She telegraphed Springfield, informing them that the only acceptable burial site for her husband would be an Oak Ridge cemetery. Furthermore, she warned them that if her wishes were not obeyed, she would have her husband interred at Chicago, or in the crypt originally prepared for George Washington beneath the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol building. It was not the response they'd been expecting. Unlike her husband, Mary Lincoln was not well liked by Springfield's intelligentsia, and this only cemented their mutually low opinions of each other. One Springfield resident bluntly described the town's feelings.
The people are in a rage, and all the hard stories that were ever told about her are told over again. She has no friends here.
Oak Ridge Cemetery's receiving vault was a community holding tomb for bodies awaiting burial. After the remains of Abraham Lincoln and his son Willie were placed there, armed soldiers were posted outside to stand guard while the public came to pay their respects. Although the vault hasn't been used since the 1870s, it still exists to this day, preserved as part of the Lincoln Tomb State Historic Site. And despite a few cosmetic alterations, it remains largely unchanged from the way it appeared when it was built. In May 1865, the National Lincoln Monument Association was incorporated. Comprised of civic and business leaders, it was headed by Illinois Governor Richard Oglesby. Their mission was to build a permanent burial place and lasting memorial for the martyred president. And as no one yet had any idea of what that would be or how or when it would be finished, the association's first task was the installation of a temporary tomb. In June 1865, construction began on the northeast slope of the hill between the receiving vault and where the final monument would eventually stand. 6 months later, the tomb was ready, and on December 21st, the bodies of President Lincoln and his sons Edward and William were transferred to their new accommodations. The association had also launched a nationwide fundraising drive, and largely through donations from private individuals, they managed to raise nearly $200,000, which is equivalent to almost $4 million today. There was also an open design competition for the Lincoln Monument. Out of the dozens of proposals received, they chose a design by Larkin Mead, an American sculptor living in Florence, Italy. His concept was for a 100-foot obelisk rising from a large base ornamented with a larger-than-life bronze sculpture of Abraham Lincoln as commander-in-chief. Complementing that theme, there would be 4 other bronzes depicting the infantry, cavalry, artillery, and navy. At the southern end of the monument would be a memorial hall where artifacts depicting the life of the great emancipator would be displayed. On the northern side would be the crypts, containing the mortal remains of Lincoln and his family. Ground was broken on September 9, 1869, and nearly 2 years later, although still incomplete, the tomb received its first occupant. But it was not the body of President Lincoln. Thomas, or Tad as his father called him, was the youngest son of Abraham and Mary Lincoln. After the death of his older brother Willie in 1862, Tad became nearly inseparable from his father. He was the only member of Lincoln's family to formally pose with him for a photograph. Known as a Little Terror, Tad had unsupervised run of the White House. He notoriously interrupted meetings and paraded goats and other animals through the halls and chambers. His behavior caused great annoyance to the president's cabinet members and White House workers, but it delighted his father, who indulged him endlessly. After learning his father was dead, Tad remarked bitterly that he was no longer a president's son, and that he was just plain old Tad now, like other little boys. In the years that followed, he was his mother's constant companion. As a result of speech and learning disorders, he had very little formal education. Mary substituted it by bringing him along on trips to Europe, where they lived for almost 3 years. After returning from one such trip in 1871, Tad became ill and died suddenly on July 17th at the age of 18. When his body was brought to Springfield for the funeral, over 2,000 attendees were on hand at Oak Ridge Cemetery when his coffin was deposited in the new tomb. He would later be joined by his 2 older brothers and his much beloved father, while work on the monument continued. After President Lincoln was moved to the permanent tomb, the temporary vault was demolished to make sure that it would not be used by anyone else. Today, a plain granite block marks the spot on the hill where it once stood. By 1874, nearly a decade had passed since Lincoln's death. His tomb was complete except for the 4 military sculptures. The Army had donated captured Confederate cannons, 25 tons worth, to be melted down and used for the bronze statues. However, the foundry had only been able to cast the statue of Abraham Lincoln. But that wasn't the only problem vexing the tomb's builders. For instance, it wasn't until after Lincoln's marble sarcophagus was completed that someone decided to measure his coffin to see if it would fit. When it didn't, the original coffin, made of walnut and decorated with sterling silver handles and badges, had to be replaced. Frustrated by delays, Richard Oglesby, chairman of the Memorial Association, raised concerns that he and the organization's other members might not live long enough to see their work completed. And rather than wait for the statues, they organized a dedication ceremony to be held on October 15, 1874. The guest of honor at the dedication was Ulysses S. Grant, the star who rose from the West during the Civil War and who, after Lincoln, was credited with saving the Union. By then, he was into his second term of a presidency that was plagued with scandal. The speech he gave that day was just as much a veiled attack on his own detractors as it was to the memory of his former commander-in-chief. Among the scores of dignitaries on hand was Lincoln's only surviving son, Robert. In January 1865, he told his father he wanted to see something of the war before it ended, so he left Harvard Law School and joined the Army. Appointed to General Grant's staff, he was present when Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. 9 years later, he was a married father of 2 with a law practice. Above it all, he carried the lifelong responsibility of being the standard-bearer of his father's legacy. Also present that day was Grant's friend and staunchest ally, William Tecumseh Sherman. He famously said that war is hell and proved it in 1864 with the Scorched Earth campaign that laid waste to Georgia. The only thing Sherman detested more than politics was politicians, but of Lincoln he said, "Of all the men I ever met, he seemed to possess more of the elements of greatness combined with goodness than any other." Another hero of the Civil War at the dedication was the brash young George Armstrong Custer. He had recently returned from an expedition into South Dakota where he confirmed the discovery of gold on French Creek, triggering the Black Hills Gold Rush. During the Indian Wars, he rose to distinction on the Great Plains with the 7th Cavalry. In less than 2 years' time, Custer's colorful military career and life would come to a sudden and shocking end at the Battle of Little Bighorn. At the conclusion of the dedication ceremony, Larkin Meade's statue of Abraham Lincoln was unveiled. As the 20,000 assembled witnesses dispersed, they believed that within his noble shrine the bones of the great and good man would finally rest in everlasting peace. But they couldn't have been more wrong. On the dark, moonless night of November 7, 1876, 3 men approached the Lincoln tomb from the northwest. They had come down to Springfield from Chicago with a bold plan. They were members of a ring of counterfeiters who had fallen on hard times ever since their engraver Ben Boyd was sent to prison for 10 years. The gang's ringleader, Big Jim Canale, hatched a scheme where they would steal the body of Abraham Lincoln and use it as leverage to secure Boyd's release. For good measure, they would also demand a $200,000 ransom. Two of the men were Jack Hughes and Terrence Mullins. The third man that night was Louis Swagels, an experienced grave robber who was brought along to help them pull off the caper. They were confident that the job would go smoothly as there was no night watchman on duty at Oak Ridge Cemetery, and the only obstacle between them and the president's body was a solitary padlock. What Hughes and Mullins did not know was that their plan was doomed almost from the moment it was hatched. Hiding on the opposite end of the tomb was the tomb's custodian and 4 Secret Service agents. Pinkerton detectives were staged outside in the distant tree line to cut off any escape. They were all waiting for a signal from Louis Swagels, who was in fact an undercover officer. Swagels had been shadowing the counterfeiters in their favorite Chicago saloon when he overheard the men boasting of their plan. He tipped off Patrick Tyrrell, who was head of the Secret Service's Chicago office and who had arrested Ben Boyd months earlier. As the agents waited, they could hear Hughes and Mullins defeat the padlock, then begin hammering at the marble sarcophagus. Then, in the darkness, a pistol shot rang out. Believing that the thieves had taken a shot at them, the Secret Service agents returned fire. Only it turned out that one of the Pinkerton men had accidentally discharged his weapon. With the element of surprise lost, the agents rushed to the catacomb to find it deserted. During the hail of gunfire, the would-be thieves had escaped into the night. Upon inspection of the tomb, they found the marble lid and front panel of the sarcophagus removed. The thieves only had time to partially drag President Lincoln's 500-pound coffin out of the sarcophagus before having to flee. Swagels returned to Chicago knowing it would only be a matter of time before Hughes and Mullins turned up there, and 10 days later they appeared at the same watering hole on West Madison Street where the plan to steal Lincoln's body was conceived. They were arrested without incident and tried and convicted of grave robbery. Both men served a year in prison for their ghoulish deed. The incident was a feather in the cap for the Secret Service, but it was humiliating for the state of Illinois. To ensure that it would never happen again, the Lincoln Guard of Honor was formed to protect the tomb from further desecration. In 1887, James Conkling, a member of the board of directors for the Lincoln Monument Association, issued a report to the public. After positively identifying the remains of the president, he attested that the coffins of he and his family were, quote,
were lowered into a vault constructed beneath the floor of the catacomb and then encased in a mass of cement 6 feet deep, 8.5 feet wide, and 11 feet long. Over that, the tessellated marble floor was relaid, and the sarcophagus placed in the position it occupied formerly.
Conkling said he was making this assertion so that he would no longer have to evade questions from visitors who wanted to know the whereabouts of the president. However, his assertion was in fact an evasion. What he could not tell them was that Abraham Lincoln's coffin was not buried beneath the catacomb. It was hidden beneath construction materials within the unused corridors of the tomb, where it would remain for another 14 years. Walking along the side paths of Oak Ridge Cemetery, grave explorers will encounter the burial places of people who played a part in Lincoln's story. And in Block 14 rests a man who not only played a part in it, but also gave us a greater understanding of his roots. William Herndon was a Springfield attorney who has the distinction of being Abraham Lincoln's last law partner. Soon after the president's death, Herndon began an extraordinary journey, crisscrossing Sangamon County and beyond, seeking out anyone who knew him in his younger days. He recorded their memories, and the following year he began a series of lectures based on his research. His presentations were a hit with the public. However, they were neither welcomed nor endorsed by Lincoln's family. It was no secret that Mary and Herndon had mutual contempt for one another. In private, he referred to Mary as that she-wolf or wildcat, and to her he was a filthy dog. Among the details that the family objected to were the claims of domestic discord in the Lincoln home. Herndon suggested that Abe was an atheist and also raised questions about the legitimacy of his mother. But what nettled Mary most of all was the girl her husband's old partner made famous more than 30 years after her death. Anne Rutledge was one of 10 children of James Rutledge, who owned a tavern in the town of New Salem, where Abraham Lincoln settled at the age of 22. According to Herndon, Anne and the future president became romantically involved, and that she was his only true love. He added that Anne's death in 1835 was the cause of Lincoln's lifelong bouts of melancholy.
Why should the spirit of mortal be proud?
Mary was humiliated by the suggestion, feeling that it galvanized her unpopularity and perpetuated the widely accepted belief that she only brought misery to her husband. But Herndon believed he was redeeming Mary's character through the Rutledge story. In a letter to one of his critics, he wrote,
"She hates me, on the same grounds that a thief hates a policeman who knows a dangerous secret about him. All of Lincoln's struggles, difficulties, etc., between himself and his wife were caused by his admission that he did not love her and instead loved another. The world does not know Mrs. Lincoln. Her sufferings, her domestic quarrels, in my opinion, sprang from a woman's revenge which she was not strong enough to resist. Through me, the world will know and sympathize with her."
The supposed romance between Lincoln and Rutledge captured the public's imagination and was advanced by biographers including Albert Beveridge and Carl Sandburg. Filmmakers like D.W. Griffith and John Ford continued the narrative in cinema into the 1940s. However, many of William Herndon's so-called witnesses could not agree if Abe and Anne were lovers or just friends, and given the fact that during the time of their supposed courtship she was engaged to another man, and that none of Lincoln's surviving letters make any mention of her, has caused modern historians to underplay the relationship or to deny it altogether. His dispute with Mary notwithstanding, Herndon might have shown deference to the First Lady by waiting until after she died before publishing his 3-volume biography of Lincoln. Although the validity of his work is in doubt, it remains a valuable source of first-hand information about Lincoln's early life, and it represents the 16th president not as a demigod, but as a man who wrestled with doubt and indecision, and in spite of his fallibilities managed to rise to greatness. Further along in Block 10 is the Edwards family plot, prominently marked with an obelisk belonging to Ninian Edwards, who governed Illinois from territory to statehood. Close by is his son Ninian Wirt and his wife Elizabeth Todd, Mary Lincoln's eldest sister. The Edwards Springfield home was a frequent setting for some of the most important events of Lincoln's early life. It was where his unlikely courtship to Mary began. Mary's sister and brother-in-law were not keen on the match, feeling that Lincoln was too coarse in manner for the well-bred girl from Kentucky. But Mary fell in love with the gangly, unkempt frontier lawyer, and it was in the Edwards front parlor that they were married in 1842. More than a century later, the close ties between the families would lead to a surprising discovery within the Edwards plot in Oak Ridge Cemetery. In the autumn of 1954, descendants of the Edwards family decided to replace the weathered and cracked marble stepping stone at the entrance of the family burying ground. As the workmen lifted the old stone out of the ground, they noticed writing on the underside. Cleaning off the mud, they read the name Lincoln, and in that instant they knew they had found something special. It turned out to be the headstone of Abraham and Mary Lincoln's son Eddie, who died at the age of 3. Realizing the significance, the cemetery alerted the Edwards family and local historians. The discovery was national news that recalled a forgotten member of the Lincoln family. Edward Baker Lincoln was born in Springfield on March 10, 1846. When his father was elected to Congress, he moved to Washington, D.C. with the family, but the swampy miasma of the capital city did not agree with Mary and the boys, and it was decided that she would return to Springfield. Back at home, Eddie seemed more prone to illness, and in early December 1849 he came down with a serious cough and fever. As the days wore on, his health steadily worsened. He struggled for breath as his lungs filled with fluid. Eventually, he became so weak that he couldn't raise his head from the pillow. He fought bravely for 52 days until early in the morning of February 1st, 1850, when his long suffering finally ended. Lincoln mentioned the tragedy in a letter to his stepbrother, stating succinctly that his second son had died and that he and Mary missed him very much. The letter greatly understated what was a devastating blow to the Lincoln family. Mary confined herself to her room for weeks, refusing to eat. Her husband pleaded with her. "We must eat, Mary," he said, "for we must live." Eventually, the couple weathered the storm and managed to cope with their loss. 10 months later, they welcomed their third child, a boy they called Willie, and he was followed in 1853 by a fourth boy named Thomas. On a cold, gray February afternoon, Eddie Lincoln was laid to rest in Hutchison Cemetery, which was located in the outskirts of town on what is now the site of Springfield High School. 15 years later, he was brought to Oak Ridge and his coffin placed in the temporary Lincoln tomb beside his father and the brother born after him. Rather than discard the old headstone, Mary gave it to Sister Elizabeth, who had the name Edwards carved into the back before placing it in the family plot where it remained for 89 years. The epitaph at the bottom reads, "Of such is the kingdom of heaven." The phrase taken from the Bible was commonly used on children's headstones in the 19th century. Curiously, historians found the same verse within an anonymously written poem entitled Little Eddie that was published in the Illinois Daily Journal 6 days after Eddie Lincoln died. It was well known that Lincoln was an amateur poet, and the line in the poem together with the epitaph on the headstone caused some to speculate that he was the author of the verse. Others felt that Little Eddie was written by a mother and therefore was penned by Mary. However, both theories are incorrect. Stylistically, the poem does not match the structure, rhythm, or meter used by Lincoln, and it is doubtful that Mary was the author, as she was far too overcome with grief to be able to compose herself, let alone a verse. Although the true author of Little Eddie remains clouded in mystery, the poem is a reminder of a lost little boy who departed this world too soon, but left an indelible mark on the lives he touched.
Little Eddie. Those midnight stars are sadly dimmed, that late so brilliantly shone, and the crimson tinge from cheek and lip, with the heart's warm life has flown. The angel death was hovering nigh, and the lovely boy was called to die. The silken waves of his glossy hair lie still over his marble brow, and the pallid lip and pearly cheek the presence of death avow. Pure little bud in kindness given, in mercy taken to bloom in heaven. Happier far is the angel child with the harp and crown of gold, who warbles now at the Savior's feet the glories to us untold. Eddie, meet blossom of heavenly love, dwells in the spirit world above. Angel boy, fare thee well, farewell, sweet Eddie, we bid thee adieu. Affection's wail cannot reach thee now, deep though it be and true. Bright in the home to him now given, for of such is the kingdom of heaven.
Eddie now rests in the Lincoln tomb with his family at Oak Ridge Cemetery. His original headstone is on public display at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library in Springfield, Illinois. The children of Springfield told stories about the mad woman living in the big house on 2nd Street near the new state capitol. They whispered about how she never left her rooms where the curtains were always drawn to keep out the light. It was said that she spent her days poring over musty clothes that were kept in large trunks, often raging that something had gone missing or was stolen. Those daring enough to conceal themselves below her window told of woeful cries emanating from within. Everyone knew that she'd been locked away in a madhouse and would be there still if she was anyone else. They wondered how it could be that this sad, wretched woman had been the wife of the great Abraham Lincoln. The ridicule of the neighborhood children was no different than any that Mary Todd Lincoln had endured for most of her adult life. When she was the First Lady, there were rumors in Washington that she was a Confederate sympathizer because she had family members fighting for the South. Her White House spending accounts were scrutinized. The lavish receptions and parties she was famous for were called disgraceful, considering that at the same time soldiers in the field were going hungry. And her habit of accepting gifts in exchange for patronage jobs raised eyebrows, with some in Congress calling for criminal investigations. But nothing was said about her visits to military hospitals where she gave comfort to the wounded and dying. She sat with them listening to their complaints and wrote letters home to their families. There was a side to Mary that her critics didn't see or didn't care to. They preferred to satirize the uncultured Westerner rather than remark about her intelligence, wit, and charm. In her youth, she was considered a great beauty and had been courted by the best in Illinois society, including Lincoln's political adversary, Stephen A. Douglas. Mary's personality was always mercurial, or as her cousin put it, as prone to sudden change as an April day. Her outbursts were almost always preceded by crippling migraines. She harbored irrational fears of poverty, abandonment, and loss that came to terrible reality with the deaths of 2 children, followed by her husband, whom she said was her all. Mr. Lincoln could always weather the worst of Mary's black moods and somehow managed to bring her back to reason. Once, after a particularly brutal tongue lashing, a friend asked him why he put up with her ill temper. Abe replied, "If you knew how little harm it does me and how much good it does her, you wouldn't wonder why I tolerate it." But with him gone, she sank into an ocean of despair. Those closest to her said that when he was struck down, she died with him. Even tragedy didn't stand in the way of public condemnation. When she complained that the monthly allowance she received from her husband's estate barely provided a living, she was criticized for being ignorant of the fact that her monthly allowance exceeded what most Americans earned in a year. Meanwhile, old debts fell into arrears and creditors threatened to go public if she didn't pay. It forced Mary to sell her old clothing, but the sale only brought out the curious who came to look and not to buy. It was another instance where she was scoured by the press. After being awarded a small annual pension, she left for Europe with Tad to escape her enemies. Then, within a few short years, Tad was taken by death. It was the blow that caused her final break with reality. She always believed that her suffering was divine punishment for ambition. Now there was no question of it in her mind. Mary had long claimed to see ghosts, which led her to spiritualism. She consulted with mediums and attended seances, hoping to find absolution in the world beyond. She had her portrait taken by spirit photographer William Mumler, whose work by that time was exposed as fraudulent by showman P.T. Barnum. Finally, her erratic behavior became more than Robert could bear. Worried that she was squandering his father's estate on charlatans, he had her committed to a mental institution. After 4 months, she was released into her sister's custody. The following year, she was declared competent and resumed control of her own affairs. Now estranged from her only surviving child, Mary traveled to Europe alone, where she would remain for the next 4 years. In declining health, she returned to Springfield and rented rooms in her sister's home. It was there on July 15, 1882, that Mary suffered a stroke and lapsed into a coma. When she died the next day at age 63, her family said that her expression was one of perfect joy and peace. Word reached Robert Lincoln in Washington, D.C., where he was serving as Secretary of War. He had barely spoken to his mother since her sanity hearings. They had attempted to reconcile, but their relationship never fully recovered. The viewing took place in the same room where Mary and Abraham were married 40 years earlier. From there, the funeral was conducted at the First Presbyterian Church. All government offices and businesses in Springfield were closed by order of the mayor. A procession followed her coffin to Oak Ridge Cemetery, where it was placed in the Lincoln tomb. It wasn't until death that she got the respect she deserved in life. At last, the venomous tongues of her critics fell silent, and the prying curiosity of an unfeeling public was no more. Now, in the embrace of those who went before, she would never again suffer betrayal, insult, or loss. Mary was separated from her much-beloved husband for 17 years, 3 months, and 1 day. When she was sealed in her coffin, the plain gold wedding band he gave her was still on her finger. On it was inscribed the words, "Love is eternal." In 1895, the National Lincoln Monument Association transferred title of the tomb over to the state of Illinois. An inspection of the structure found significant deterioration a mere 21 years after it was completed. Much of the damage was due to the improper construction of the tomb's foundation, which was only 6 feet deep. Faced with a tomb that was dangerously weak and slowly sinking into the earth, Illinois Governor John Tanner received a $100,000 emergency appropriation to make the necessary repairs. Work began in 1899, but first Lincoln's coffin was moved from its hidden location within the tomb, where it had resided for almost a quarter of a century. Then the crypts containing the remains of Mary, Edward, William, and Thomas were cleared. There was also Abraham Lincoln's grandson and namesake, or Jack as his family called him. Jack was the second child and only son of Robert Lincoln. Described as unpretentious and intelligent, he possessed many of his grandfather's traits. He was also an athletic boy who enjoyed baseball and riding his penny-farthing bicycle. In 1889, he moved to London with his family while his father served as ambassador to the court of St. James. That November, he underwent minor surgery to remove a boil that became infected. Jack never fully recovered and died in March 1890 at age 18. His body was returned to America and placed in the Lincoln tomb, where it remained until after his father's death in 1926. He was then moved to Arlington National Cemetery and placed at his side. The 6 coffins were relocated to a temporary underground vault constructed a few feet away from the tomb. Concrete slabs were placed over the opening along with other debris to hide them from view. Once they were safely secure, construction on the tomb began. The massive obelisk was dismantled and the granite exterior stripped away, exposing the brickwork. Larkin Meade's statues were removed and stored unceremoniously behind a crudely built fence that almost comically warned the curious to keep out. Then a new foundation was laid into the bedrock 23 feet deep, and the obelisk was rebuilt. Only now it was increased in size to an overall height of 117 feet. With the tomb securely reassembled and no longer in danger of sinking, all that remained was to return the bodies to their permanent resting places. In April 1901, the temporary vault was opened, and one by one the coffins removed. First were Lincoln's children, and then his wife. As the somber work continued, crowds of onlookers dressed in their Sunday best began collecting at the site. Many of them knew the martyred president in life, like Josephine Edwards, who was Mary Lincoln's niece by marriage. When she was a child, Lincoln called her Little Josie and carried her about the neighborhood on his shoulders. Then, as the sun began to set, the shadows of two anonymous workers fell across the final casket. After securing the hook to the ropes, the crane operator slowly lifted Abraham Lincoln's mortal remains out of the ground. The onlookers watched as the pine box swung into the air. Their voices fell silent as the weight of what they were witnessing settled upon them. When the box was gently lowered to the ground just outside the tomb's entrance, the workmen began disassembling the pine crate, exposing the coffin within. Then all at once everyone removed their hats and bowed their heads. There were muffled sobs and whispered prayers as nearly everyone wiped tears from their eyes. Finally, the workmen carried Abraham Lincoln's coffin into the tomb and placed it back in its marble sarcophagus. As the sun sank deeper into the west, the crowds went away, leaving the men to finish their work without distraction. The following month, Robert arrived at the tomb to survey the work. However, he was displeased over the security precautions that were in place, that consisted only of a burglar alarm connected to the custodian's house standing adjacent to the tomb. The failed attempt to steal his father's remains still weighed heavily on his mind. He worried that a more competent set of thieves than the last ones might actually be able to pull it off. Perhaps inspired by James Conkling's claims of having encased President Lincoln's coffin in cement, Robert ordered that it be done, and forever put him beyond reach of grave robbers. It was a shock to some, but the son's wishes were final. In September of that year, his orders were carried out, but not before his father's remains were viewed one last time by dignitaries, including young Fleetwood Lindley, who recalled the moment for Life magazine 6 decades later. With their monumental task complete, everyone believed that the tomb and its occupants would forever be undisturbed. But that wouldn't be the case. As the 20th century progressed, the generation who had known the living Lincoln had all but passed away. They were the ones who had molded, shaped, and consecrated a humble prairie rail splitter into an American messiah. Although his memory would pass down through the ages unsullied by time, the temples built to him would not. By the centennial of his birth, over 1 million people had visited his tomb, and over 1 million more would follow in the subsequent 2 decades. As years passed, people began to remark about the tomb's shabby appearance and musty odor. There were complaints that some of the Lincoln exhibits in the Memorial Hall were tacky and had nothing to do with the Civil War president. Many of the artifacts belonged to Herbert Wells Fay, the tomb's custodian since 1921. An inveterate collector, Fay was known as the man of 1 million relics. Visitors noted that his light-hearted lectures lacked dignity and were compared to the babblings of a sideshow barker. But most found Fay's enthusiasm and love of Lincoln to be infectious, and in Springfield he was seen as an institution. After his death in 1949, he was laid to rest at Oak Ridge Cemetery in full view of the tomb he cherished. By 1928, the tomb was in a state of serious deterioration, and it became evident that it would need another major refurbishment. Once again, heavy equipment rolled into the peaceful surroundings of Oak Ridge Cemetery. Repeating what was done at the turn of the century, cranes removed the statuary one at a time. Here, the unseated Lincoln stands at the foot of his monument. Then scaffolding was raised in order to take down the towering obelisk block by block. The bodies of Mary Lincoln and the children were quietly relocated to the Oak Ridge Abbey Mausoleum, where they were kept in unmarked crypts. Abraham Lincoln's coffin, still encased in cement, would remain in place at the tomb while construction continued. Aside from improvements to prevent water leakage, the most significant change was made to the tomb's interior. The catacomb containing Lincoln's sarcophagus was enlarged to permit visitors to pass through the interior instead of viewing it from the outside as before. The marble sarcophagus that had remained empty since the attempted theft of Lincoln's body in 1876 was replaced with an enormous cenotaph made of red Arkansas marble. Having served its purpose, the sarcophagus was moved outside of the tomb, where it was chipped away by relic hunters. Its fate is uncertain, but it is assumed that it was destroyed to prevent further desecration. On June 17, 1931, President Herbert Hoover rededicated the tomb, calling it a shrine to all Americans. Construction had lasted more than a year and cost the state of Illinois $175,000. After the ceremony was done, the public got its first look at the Lincoln tomb we see today. Welcoming visitors at the tomb is Gutzon Borglum's bust of a young, beardless Lincoln that was added in 1931. The work is a copy of an original which is housed in the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. It has become tradition for visitors to touch Lincoln's nose for good luck. Thousands of hands have rubbed the finish to a high luster that gleams in the sunlight. At the base of the obelisk are Larkin Meade's 4 group sculptures honoring the branches of the military that fought in the Civil War. The first is an infantry scene showing an officer carrying a flag as he leads his men forward into battle. At the southeast corner of the obelisk is the cavalry group. Here a riderless horse rears in terror while a soldier supports his dying comrade who was thrown from his mount. On the northwest pedestal is the artillery group. Here a commanding officer climbs over a damaged gun, raising his saber while his men react to the advancing enemy. The last is the Navy group, depicting a scene on a gunboat. A gunner has rolled up a shell for firing as a powder monkey climbs atop a mortar. To one side, an officer raises his telescope to assess the target. It is worth noting that these statues do not romanticize the war, and in fact show the terror and sacrifice made by those who had borne the battle. Finally, we come to the statue of Abraham Lincoln, who holds in his hand a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation. On the pedestal below is the coat of arms of the United States of America. Above the tomb's entrance is a plaque with the text of the Gettysburg Address. In the center of the rotunda is Daniel Chester French's bronze miniature of the seated Lincoln from the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Originally, the rotunda was separated from the burial chamber by unused passageways. Today they are joined by 2 marble corridors displaying statuary representing the life and career of the great emancipator. The first sculpture is titled The Soldier by Leonard Crenell. It shows Lincoln during the Black Hawk War of 1832. It is a copy of an original full-size statue in Dixon, Illinois. Next is The Ranger, the first of 2 equestrian statues by Fred Torrey. It depicts Lincoln during the 80 days he served in the Black Hawk War. The second Torrey creation is called The Circuit Rider. It shows Lincoln as a lawyer traveling on horseback along the 450-mile-long 8th Judicial Circuit, which he rode twice a year. Just outside of the sarcophagus chamber is the Augustus St. Gaudens masterpiece of Lincoln rising to speak. The original stands in Chicago, where it was unveiled by Lincoln's grandson in 1887. Here, too, is a plaque with the text of the farewell speech Lincoln gave when he departed Springfield to become President of the United States. In the opposite corridors, the seated centennial statue sculpted by Adolph A. Weinman. The original is located near Lincoln's birthplace in Hodgenville, Kentucky, and was dedicated by Robert Lincoln in 1909. Beyond that is Lincoln the Debater by Leonard Crennel. The original is located in Freeport, Illinois, and was dedicated in 1929. It shows Lincoln waiting to answer a question posed by Stephen Douglas during their famous debates. Notice how the skirt of Lincoln's frock coat appears to be blown by a wind at his back, suggesting he is on the side of righteousness. Next is Lincoln the Lawyer by Laredo Taft, showing Lincoln arguing a case in court. The original stands in Urbana, Illinois, which was a frequent stop for him on the judicial circuit. The final sculpture is by Daniel Chester French. In addition to his epic statue in the Lincoln Memorial, French created this work of the emancipator as he is about to deliver the Gettysburg Address. The original stands outside the State House in Lincoln, Nebraska. At the apex of the two corridors is the sarcophagus chamber. It contains the crypts of Mary Lincoln and 3 of her 4 sons. The tomb was designed with space for Robert Lincoln and his family. However, he chose to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Opposite the crypts are flags representing the 7 states in which Lincoln's family lived from the time of their arrival in America until his death. The flags of the United States and President are also displayed. The burial chamber is dominated by a red marble cenotaph inscribed, Abraham Lincoln, 1809-1865. Lincoln's body does not lie within or directly below this massive stone. He rests in his concrete vault 10 feet below the floor and 6 feet from the north wall with his head to the west. Above this monument, inscribed within the black marble, are the immortal words spoken by Edwin Stanton at Lincoln's deathbed. Now he belongs to the ages.